Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction. Bill, I just wanted to start off asking you about this task, this daunting task you set for yourself. The subtitle of the book, Walking 6,000 Miles in the City, signals your primary research method for the book. How did this process come into being? How did you arrive at the decision to actually undertake what was really not just a feat of scholarship, but also a feat of athletic endurance?
Yes, it certainly felt that way. I had been teaching a course in New York City for 35 years and up, at either the master's level or the PhD level. And one day the chair of the department at the Graduate Center said, you've been teaching a course so long in this, why don't you just write a book about it? And I looked at the bibliographies that I've been using, the readings that I've been using, and I discovered that there really was no one single book about the city. And in our field of sociology, normally the way people do things is they'll take a neighborhood, be it Canarsie, be it the Upper West Side, study it intensively for a period of time, and maybe something like in Mitch Denier's classic book, Sidewalk, they'll study the sidewalk vendors along 6th Avenue. In Washington, D.C., they'll do Tally's Corner, and things like that. But no one had ever even done a book about a single borough in a sociological term. And so I started to think I would do that. The question was how? I happened to run into the director of Princeton University Press at a conference, at a meeting, and he asked me what I was working on. I told him, and then he said, "Oh, that's great. Can you write the next Beyond the Melting Pot?" Well, I do not have such pretensions. Beyond the Melting Pot was a great book written by Daniel Patrick Moynihan and Nathan Glazer. But I said I could write a book about New York City, and he said write a proposal. The proposal was to walk 20 representative streets of the city. Be that, like in this area, instead of doing 8th Street, maybe do 9th Street. Instead of doing 57th Street, do 54th. Instead of 125th, do 124th. And then combine it with Broadway, with Myrtle Avenue, known as Murder Avenue during the 1980s. And write a book based on 20 representative streets. But I soon discovered that there is no way to determine in a city of 121,000 blocks that any 20 streets could really be representative of the city as a whole. And so I reluctantly, perhaps not so reluctantly, decided that I would walk the entire city. Now, the reason I say not so reluctantly is I once mused aloud to a friend of mine, Bill Kornblum, a colleague, about that it was strange to me when I thought about it that no one had ever done a book about the entire city. He says, something, maybe nobody was crazy enough to walk it. And something, you do have to be a little crazy to walk this city. Not so crazy that you get locked up, but you do have to be willing to do something that's really out of the box.
Did you ever find yourself reciting the title of your earlier book in your head as you were undertaking this task?
Kirk is referring to a book, What Was I Thinking? The Dumb Things We Do and How to Avoid Them. Well, being that I signed a contract, it was too late to avoid it. And as far as thinking about it, no, I must say I didn't, because in truth, the spark for this journey began when I was a little kid. I grew up on the West Side, and my father played a game with me called Last Stop. And every weekend, we would take the subway to the last stop, and we would walk around the neighborhood for an hour or 2 or 3 or whatever. And this was a game we played. And when we ran out of last stops, we went to the second to last stop, and then to the third to last stop. And that's really how I learned to love the city. I went to places I knew nothing about. I was a city kid. I lived on 105th Street between Columbus and Amsterdam, belonged to what passed for a gang, and played stickball in the streets. And when I came to Throg's Neck, we had taken a subway and then a bus, and I saw people fishing. It was amazing to me. I'd never seen anybody fishing before. I knew fish came from the fish store, but I wasn't quite sure of the connection. And when I went to Canarsie, and it was swampland and marshland back in the late 50s, and I remembered my teacher having told me that he would send me here if I misbehaved, and then I understood the consequences of that. And there were all sorts of weird things that happened. My father took me everywhere. My father gave me the gift of time, not the gift of gifts. And that was very, very important. And so I learned to love the city that way. And now, even when I walked around the neighborhoods, you know, I would remember things like when I would go to Times Square, I always remembered how my father took me when I was 14 years old to Times Square, and someone pickpocketed my wallet. Fortunately, there was nothing in it, but that's his loss or her loss or whatever happened. I don't know what happened. So I've really walked the city about 15, 16 times in total, when you come down to it, in pieces. But I had never walked it before systematically. And the difference is that when you walk it systematically, you have to walk all the streets that you didn't normally walk. Like so many people, I grew up in a neighborhood. I'm sure you've had this experience where you grow up in a neighborhood and you think you know the neighborhood. I'm from Bay Ridge. I know Bay Ridge. But really, when it comes right down to it, the Bay Ridge you know is where you hung out, where you went for religious services, where you went to school, where you played ball, your favorite candy store, grocery store, and then there are all these blocks that you missed. So when I walked in Washington Heights, a neighborhood we later lived in, I realized that I had walked on 164th, but never on 163rd. I'd walked on 161st, but never on 159th. And when you do it systematically, it's different. How did I do that? I had little maps, and I would take a pen at the end of the day, and I would just draw a pen through all the streets I'd walked so that I wouldn't miss any. And the way in which I tabulated it was this. I had this Omron pedometer that measured, and every night I wrote down how many miles I had walked. And these shoes, and that's why, I don't want to dress in any way different. This is to some extent how I walk the streets. These shoes say SAS on the back. They're the 9 pairs of shoes I wore out in order to do this walk. And so the walk was really a part of my soul. It really, really is. And when you when you think about walking, to me, this is an effort to capture the heart, soul, and pulse of the city. I don't think that you can apprehend the city like this in any statistical kind of fashion. And it's really an inner portrait. And those of you, if you've read the book, you either feel I got it or I didn't get it. I hope I got it, or I hope I got some of it. But the truth of the matter is that you can really only capture a city by walking, by engaging the people, by talking to them. You drive through it, you can't do it. It's too fast. You bike through it. Yes, that's the next best way to doing it. And by the way, about the craziness thing, one time I got into a cab and I talked to a Senegalese cab driver, and I said, "What do you do?" He says, "Oh, I'm a marathon runner. I run the marathon." And he says, "What do you do?" I said, "Well, I walk around, I look at the city. I take walks. I'm walking the whole city," I told him. He says, "Wow, that's a hard job." I said, "That's a hard job. What about your job? You got to run. You got to run your butt off all over the place." And he said to me, "Yes," he says, "but your job is so boring." I never thought of it that way. He says, "I can get to where I'm going in 10 minutes. He says, "It will take you hours." In other words, this is a man who mistook, the journey and the destination. For him, the destination was getting there. For me, the destination was being there. It's sort of like the difference between having your kid in the back seat of a car and your dog in the back seat of a car. With your kid, it's, when are we going to get there? When are we going to get there? With your dog, he or she is there already. They're with you. They're in the car. There's no place to go.
The book is a lot about seeing. The reporting is about seeing, and that informs a lot of the book. You acknowledge that your view of the city, as you've done tonight, was incomplete. as well as you knew the city before you set off on this amazing odyssey. At one point, you write, if I recall correctly, that the outer boroughs turned out to be more interesting than you had anticipated, which begs the question: what did you anticipate? What did you think you knew about the city that you came to know? Once again.
Yes. Well, I have to say that having lived in Queens, having lived in Manhattan, and having been very familiar with the other boroughs, perhaps because I grew up in Manhattan, the epicenter of the city seemed to be Manhattan-centric. But that in reality, in part, I think that the reason the outer boroughs were so interesting to me was that I had not sufficiently explored them. And the things there were newer to me. They were not the things that I knew about. And, for example, the most forgotten borough of all is Staten Island. Did I know, before I embarked on this journey, even though I took my students on walks around the city, that they have a fairly pristine 4-mile red sand beach? A place where more than 100 films were made in the late 1890s, early 1900s. Did I know that there's I think it's $5 or $6 million Chinese Scholars Garden in Snug Harbor? Did I know about Toad Hill, other than the fact that the mobster Paul Castellano lived there? Did I know that it is the highest point along the eastern seaboard? Did I understand the type of palazzos that were built there when people are spending $1 million+ to live in nice apartments in Manhattan that consist of 1 bedroom, and these people had like 20, 30 rooms? It's not a judgment. It's more an expression of the reality of New York, which is that it's incredibly complex. And it's the people that make it so complex. The people that come from all corners of the world, the 37.1% at the last guess, I think, that are foreign born, not to mention the children of the immigrants who were born here. This is a city that for whom immigration is the norm. It's not like people visiting a city. In many ways, they are the city. That, plus the millions of people who come from all over the United States to find their fortune here, who either stay or don't stay. So that's what I found there. And I also found, and it was a central theme of the book, that New York City is really made up of hundreds of separate communities. Separate in the sense that they have their own clear identity. People who live in Flatbush, or people who live in Alphabet City, shall we say, here in Manhattan, or people who live in Inwood, they have distinct identities. They have a consciousness that they live somewhere, and that somewhere isn't a neighborhood. It's a place, it's a community, it's a place where they all know each other on the block, where they know each other in the building. But it's also interwoven with the idea that they live in a great 21st century metropolis, and that they are all bound together by the knowledge and consciousness that they exist in this incredibly sophisticated environment that nevertheless allows them to return home, let their hair down and be who they want to be, and sit out on their porch and dream and reflect about what life means to them and what life means in their communities. Now, the difference between the communities of New York City in the outer boroughs, and of course there are communities obviously everywhere in New York City, but on every block. But the difference between those communities and communities elsewhere in the United States is that within 40 minutes, at the drop of a coin into an express bus that goes to Manhattan, they can go from Edgewater Park to Bronx, which is sort of like a fishing community, and be in Times Square, or be in Manhattan, be on Wall Street, be wherever they want to be. You can't do that if you're living in a community in Nebraska. You can't get to the greatest metropolis in the world in 40 minutes. You might be able to get to Omaha if you were striking distance. And if any of you here have seen the film Nebraska, which for me was so meaningful, I've already seen it twice, you see that we have a certain culture, they have a certain culture, they have a certain lifestyle. Of course, we're bound by the fact of being Americans, which, by the way, brings me back to Staten Island. The interesting thing about Staten Islanders is nowhere in the city did I see a greater proliferation of American flags flying from people's homes. And so I thought to myself, well, is this an expression of, the more conservative Americans so stereotyped that they have flags outside their homes in Glendale, Queens, and in Ridgewood, any of the neighborhoods that are more working class, Ozone Park. But it was really something different. It was that the people of Staten Island felt abandoned. They felt rejected by the rest of New Yorkers. They felt that they were a laughingstock, made fun of because of the landfill and the garbage dump and everything else. And what they basically were saying, well, okay, the rest of New York, if you won't accept us, so you won't accept us. But we're Americans, and we're part of a bigger place. And when I tried out that thesis on a couple of people, they tended to agree with me. They felt isolated, but they felt part of America at large. And then, to talk about the immigrant experience, I would go through, I remember walking up a street in Queens and seeing a man standing outside his home, and he had beautiful flowers in the border, sort of between the gutter and the beginnings of the steps leading up to his porch. And I said, these are such beautiful flowers you have here. Where'd you get the idea to put these flowers here? He said, oh, I'm glad you asked me. He said, these flowers are really from my home country in Guyana. They're native to my home country in Guyana. And I planted them here so that every morning when I go to my difficult job in the city, I can look at them and remember the beautiful land that I left behind. And I thought to myself, this speaks volumes about immigration. This really tells me about the push and the pull and the tug and the yearning and the changed lives and the complicated paths that people take when they get here. May I add, a path similarly taken by people who came here 70, 80, 90, 100 years ago. It's just the latest group of people. When I walked down 8th Street in Guyanese, and I saw in a brownstone on the first floor, it was a completely residential block between 2nd and 3rd Avenue. It said P. DeRosa Grocery in gold letters. And near it was a Budweiser sign and a Schaefer sign, Old Beers of Brooklyn. And I said to myself, what's this doing here? And luckily, and by the way, this is part of the walking thing, Kirk, happened to be my luck. My luck that a woman was sitting on the steps, a woman who originally hailed from Venezuela. And I said, why is that grocery sign there? This isn't a grocery store. And she says, used to be 20 years ago. The man closed it. 20 years ago it was a grocery store for Mr. DeRosa. He came here from Naples. And this was his home. And so his children made sure that this grocery store sign would stay there. When I eventually found and tracked down, because you have to be careful, you can't just take a story at face value. I tracked him down. He invited me into the house. I saw the house. The house was residential, and he said, yes, he said, this is why, he says, we wanted to keep the memory. This is what he lived for, to come to America and be a business owner. And so we wanted to remember that. And his wife, who told me she originally came from Ireland, said, it's a sign of respect, she said softly. Respect. That's what it's all about. And this taught me a lesson about filial piety. Now, by the way, when I did these interviews, they were not interviews in a casual sense. They were conversations. I never started off my interview by saying, I'm writing a book about New York. You can forget that. You can't do that in New York.
What were you carrying? Were you carrying a notebook, tape recorder?
I had a little pad with me all the time. I had a tape recorder, and sometimes I would just talk into the tape recorder. The people could clearly see what I was doing. Very, very rarely did they even ask me what I was doing. We're in a society today where people are talking to themselves in the supermarket. They got to remember this, they got to remember that. It's not like, what are you spying on me or anything like that. And by the way, hardly anybody in my 6,000 mile trek refused to talk to me.
That was one of the most telling conclusions you made in your book. I thought that you found that contrary to the popular perception that New York is a city full of angry, misanthropic people, that in fact you were always greeted pretty warmly.
Not only was I greeted warmly, but people would unload on me sort of the stranger effect, like, I don't have to pay a price if I tell you this, because I'm not going to see you again anyway. So I'd be waiting for a bus.
You sometimes don't even have to engage somebody to get that in New York. Oftentimes that comes unsolicited.
That definitely comes unsolicited. And here I was sitting at the bus, and she said to me, I'm telling you, I'm going to kill my sister. I know she's messing up. She's messing around with my bank account. I say, are you going to take care of this now? She said, I'm on my way over to her bank. Boy, am I going to give it to her. Or a woman who had just been chewed out by her boss somewhere in Tribeca. She was working as a waitress. I would say, I'm not coming on to you, but do you mind if I sit down on this bench here? I'm tired. I want to take a rest. She says, sure, you can sit down here. And then she told me the whole story about, how her boss had yelled at her and how depressed she felt. She says, look at this cigarette. I haven't smoked a cigarette in 5 years. Look what he's causing me to do. So that I found that it's a most engaging city. Now, by the way, I've lived in St. Louis. I've lived in Atlanta. I've spent time in many other cities, and I would say that this isn't unique to all New Yorkers. It's just that you don't expect it. It defies the stereotypical image of the cold, hard city. In fact, I'd reverse it. People say New York's a great place to visit, but I wouldn't want to live here. No, I say New York's a great place to live in, but I wouldn't want to visit here. Because then I wouldn't know what's going on.
What were some of the other big revelations you had during your trip? I mean, you mentioned smaller ones. You mentioned the Scholars Garden. You mentioned the beach on Staten Island. And of course, your book is full of surprises, your discoveries. But thematically, what were some of the larger?
Some of the larger issues. One of them concerned immigration, which is the degree to which immigrants who come here not only manage to get along with each other and not only manage to cope here, but the degree to which groups that are often at odds with each other in their home countries put aside their differences. And one of the people said to me, everybody's new here, maybe that's why. But you could see, and I do see, Pakistanis and Indians working together amicably here in the city, much more so than in their home countries. I took note of the fact that Polish immigrants who were Christian who came here tended sometimes to live in Jewish neighborhoods like Borough Park, Brooklyn, open up grocery stores there. And I thought to myself, these two groups have a long history of animosity. Yet here, they get along, they have a symbiotic relationship. But what about Muslims and Jews on Coney Island Avenue operating stores side by side? In the book there's a photo of them. So the degree to which immigrants got along here, their work ethic didn't surprise me. This is true of immigrants throughout. When it came to gentrification, I found a number of interesting things about gentrification. One of them was that when you walk it on the spot, when you're there, you can see the unevenness of change in gentrifying neighborhoods. You take 124th Street and Lexington Avenue, a place where people drop off bottles, fairly high crime area. 1 block down, people are buying condos, 2-bedroom apartments for $500,000 on 124th Street and 3rd Avenue. And this whole process struck me as one that needed to be further explored.
Well, yeah, one of the truths that emerges from that section of your book that really resonated with me was the idea that gentrification is a far more complex calculus than the caricature. I think the oversimplified caricature that we usually see rendered in conversations about gentrification. That is, upper middle class whites moving into an area and forcing out underclass blacks, and it's rarely that simple. Can you talk about that a little bit more?
It's really very, very complicated, as you said, and it would take a lot more than we have time for to fully explicate it. I discuss it in the book, but just to take it from the top of the last point about upper middle class whites driving out an underclass of blacks, are we not forgetting the fact that a lot of the gentrifiers are black, that a lot of gentrifiers are Hispanic, and that they themselves often come into conflict with people in the neighborhood, but that the basis of the conflict is more often class than race. So that a woman who runs the Aquaba mansion on McDonough Street in the Bedford-Stuyvesant section of Brooklyn, which is a place that you can go to and get a room for $185 a night instead of spending $400 here, and yet 19 minutes away on the A train from Nostrand Avenue to 34th Street, said to me, when I came here, I bought up the property on Lewis Avenue, and I bought it up because I wanted people to buy stuff here, but I wanted to restrict it to people who were from the neighborhood in the neighborhood. And then when I wanted to start a wine bar, the black people in the community resisted it. I said, what's wrong with starting a nice wine bar? We don't want any winos here. And you could see the divide. Even the term was strange. And then they said to her, where are your people from? Meaning, I don't know you. What are you doing here? Why are you here? And she was, of course, mightily offended. I also found in gentrification, one of the things that we need to understand is, here's a question to ask. Why is it that today people will buy apartments a block away from a crack house, and they'll spend $500,000, and they don't give a damn? They don't really care. And when you ask them, they say, I can't be bothered with that. So what happened? In the 50s, integration was the word that was used from the time the first black person moved into the neighborhood and the last white person ran away. Why did all that change? Well, to do that, you need to understand that historically, in the 50s, the city was not prepared for the hundreds of thousands of black people that came impoverished from the South, and the hundreds of thousands of Puerto Ricans who came here starting after 1952, and the city was overwhelmed. It didn't have the network of social services that we have today. It didn't have anything resembling what we have today. And so people were urban relocated. They were pushed out of the more slummy Lincoln's Center area and pushed into projects in Brownsville, and then the numbers were so overwhelming that the neighborhoods changed. Plus, the people didn't have overpriced places to go to. They had Canarsie, they had Mill Basin. Everything was different then. The number of things that have changed here I've discussed in the book, but just understand that today the reality is that people don't feel that way. Part of the reason is the low crime rate. There's no question about it, but it's also a different way of looking at the city, of feeling I'm here and I'm not going anywhere, and besides, I have nowhere to go. Look at the reverse migration. And now I shouldn't use the word migration, I mean reverse travel. That I noticed this, that on Mother's Day, if you look at the highways in New York City, the flow is outward towards the suburbs. And in the old days, the flow was inward. Why was that? In the 50s and the 60s, people were buying a dream in the suburbs, like Ken Jackson's book, Crabgrass Frontier. They were buying a dream in the suburbs, and they wanted to live out there. And the kids would come out, the travel pattern was such that the young people were there, and they went back to the city to visit the aging parents. Today, it's the other way around. The people in the city are visiting the aging parents in the suburbs on their way down to Florida. I mean, the parents are on their way down to Florida. God's waiting room, they call it. And so many things have changed. Gentrifiers come in all forms. I described in the book the gentrifier who says, I can get along with the Dominicans who are living here in the 140s because I buy pop from them. And so I have a relationship with them because I'm cool. Some of my friends are not cool. Don't do that kind of stuff. And the other person said to me, he lived on 136th Street, and he lived in the only newly built building between Broadway and Amsterdam Avenue. He says, I don't have much to do with these people. And don't think it's because they're Hispanic. His wife is Hispanic. He doesn't have anything to do with them because he doesn't want to send his kids to school with them. He has a different view of things, which is another thing about gentrification. It's often side by side in neighborhoods. It's not like the people are really getting together and going out to the movies together or to dinner. And you know, part of the reason is there is a cultural divide. There are different interests, different backgrounds. Some of the people are looking for authenticity when they come to gentrify. Some of them are preservationists. Some of them just want a cheap place that's close to work. Some of them want authenticity, but it turns out that often they want it in smaller doses. They got a little more than they bargained for sometimes. They wanted it, but they didn't want to be drinking wine in a paper bag outside a bodega. They want to be in Starbucks. And the people who live there, the people who live there, they're not so happy that all these white people are coming. I had black people complain to me plenty of times. Too many whites coming to Harlem. This has got to change. The whole neighborhood is going. So, like you said, Kirk, this is a very, very complicated subject, and we could go on and on.
Bill, you have some slides. Do you want to show those?
Sure, I'll be happy to show them. Let's start with, well, I'm the one that has to start, so I guess. This one's just a joke. I mean, you know, Lucky is the most popular name of stores in New York City. Only this one really got to me. I can understand Lucky Deli, maybe you'll win the lottery, but Lucky Fish? I don't think the fish are lucky, that's for damn sure. This is on Forsyth Street. This is where, in Harmony, live the Hells Angels motorcycle gang and a group of law students in a law school building. And the law students told me they keep the neighborhood safe. So that's why they don't object that they're there. This is just a sign of what Janet Sadiq and other people did to make the streets more pedestrian friendly. I'm sure you know that that's the 34th Street area. This is important. Does anybody know where this is?
I do.
Yes, it is a waterfall.
Yes.
Bingo, you're right. You're right on target. This is 51st Street, Green Acres Park, a private park run by the Rockefellers, and it's a most beautiful waterfall. If you sit in that waterfall, it's between 2nd and 3rd Avenue, and you just listen to the water roaring over. If you close your eyes, you could think you're in the Adirondacks. It drowns out the noise of all the traffic, all the trucks. A couple of doormen I met around the area go there and have their lunch. And it's beautiful. But you know what the most beautiful waterfall in New York City is? Who's got the answer to that one? The river? No, natural waterfall. In other words, part of a river. That's a hint. Yes. Where in the Bronx? Got it. This man knows. On 180th Street by Boston Road, if you stand on 180th Street and you look, right now it's under construction, but in a few months it'll be done. There's a waterfall that I would estimate is about a third of a mile wide. It sits on the property of the Botanical Gardens and right next to one of the entrances to the Bronx Zoo. And you can, by the way, the city is safe, in my view, almost any place, especially during the day, mostly during the day. And at night, there are certain neighborhoods I wouldn't tell you to go into. And you take a chance always, whatever you do in life. But the fact of the matter is that waterfall is I don't mean this one, but I mean the waterfall in the Bronx is a natural waterfall. It runs over the Bronx River. Thousands and thousands of people, good citizens of this fair city, have worked hard to remove many, many thousands of tires and car wrecks out of that river so that water can flow. And right now it's being closed because of something to do with the fish swimming upstream. Now this is I found this in a book, in the window of a restaurant. What would that be doing there? What would that be doing there? I mean, yes, I know it's books. So, you know, somebody told me at a talk I gave, must be books people left behind in the restaurant and didn't come back for. Well, that's a logical assumption, only they're all the same size. Yes, but the variations are kind of small, but yeah, they are the same size. Right, but more than that. These are the names, these are the books. You've got Moneyball, you've got Danielle Steele. This is not a gemütlich type of group here. These are all people the woman told me, who mentioned my father's restaurant in their book. And if you mention my father's restaurant in your book, you'll be here too. I have to say, I haven't gotten around to doing this yet, but I'll give him a copy of my book one day, for sure. It's on a restaurant just west of 60th Street. Now this, if you look carefully, up on the top there, on the 4th floor, there's the letter M. Now, I'm used to buildings having names, the Dorothy, the Claire, the who knows what.
And this is I'm glad we've come to this, because this is, again, gets back to this idea of seeing, and also, and the flip side of that is not seeing.
Yes. I've trained as an orthographer. You have to have an eye. You have to be looking, and when you walk slowly enough, you look. And like the flaneurs of old used to do, you have to stroll through the city. You can't do this too fast. Somebody told me they wanted to do an article. They want to go on a walking tour with me. And they kept quickening their pace. And I said, hey, what's your hurry? Where are you running to? She says, well, I thought we were going to do walking. I brought my walking shoes. I said, I don't care what you brought with you. You're not going to see the city by running through it. I said, we're here in the Marcy housing projects, where the rapper Jay-Z grew up, and we're looking at a beautiful garden in the interior part that the people of the community have erected. Don't you think that that's something we ought to be stopping and looking? We don't want to run by that. So here, I look and I say, what's the M doing there? I asked the doorman. He gives me a quizzical look. Where, what M? I said, up there. He looks, I don't know. And he was totally unfamiliar with it. So I waited till some people came out of the building, and I said to this woman, what's this M doing there? She says, I don't know. I said, how long have you lived in the building? She says, about 20 years. I said, you live in this building, 20 years, and you don't know what that M is doing there? She says, I never noticed it before. And she says, as an apology, she says, most of the time I lived on the 11th floor, and so I never noticed it. I said, where do you live now? She looks at the thing, and she says, well, I live right under the M. I said, how long you been living there? She says, 3 years. I said, 3 years under the M, and you don't know what the M is doing there? She says, no. Well, I eventually learned, by the way, you must be so persistent in the city in order to find things, in order to see and understand things. And you got to go that last mile. Herc's a journalist, and I must say an outstanding one. I before we ever met, and before this was ever planned, I cited 12 of his articles in my book, because he's a great writer, and he covered stuff that was really spot on here on immigration and on cities and on people in the cities. And when I did this, I found out eventually that at one time, many years ago, the gold handles of the doorknobs had the letter M carved into them. Apparently it had something to do with the ownership, the original ownership of the building. But when I called the realty company, they didn't know. And by the way, you must know that people try to extract meaning from coincidences in order to give justification to their own experiences. What I'm referring to is that I lived on 164th Street for a while at 106 Fort Washington Avenue, and the name of the building when I lived there in the late 60s was Samana Mansion. That's how we called it, Samana Mansion, S-A-M-A-N-A. Did I ever think about it? I never even realized that maybe there was someone named Samana. I had no idea what it was doing there. And then, when I came back and paid a revisit, and so much of this book, as I said before about Times Square, is revisiting neighborhoods, I came back, I started talking to the Dominican superintendent. He told me, we have gentrification, we have people coming from Colombia, we have people coming from all over, not the country, the university, and they're coming from all over here, and the students are taking over the apartments. This neighborhood's getting to be really good and everything, but it's slowly changing. He says, and you know something interesting, he said suddenly to me, and this is, by the way, you get that aha moment when you do research. The research, people say to me, why don't you just walk 1 hour? And I said, no, I had to walk 4 hours, because how did I know when the inside of the day was going to come? Maybe in the first half hour, but maybe in the last 20 minutes. And that's why you got to walk all the hours. You can't cheat. Anyway, who are you cheating? Cheating yourself? You may be cheating other people. You're not fooling yourself. If you didn't do it, you didn't do it. And so the only point I wanted to make was, he said, look at this. Do you know what Samana means? And I say, no. He says, there's a Samana Peninsula in the Dominican Republic, and a great whale washed up there. And it became a tourist site, and all the people came to see it. And look, this building called Samana Mansion is now full of Dominicans. So I learned about cause and effect in college, but this one didn't seem to work out too well for me because the building had been called Samana for 80 years. And so it wasn't because of the Samana Peninsula. I said, do you know that the name was Samana when I lived here 40 years ago? That doesn't matter. That doesn't matter. And Samana is the name of a mountain range in the Himalayas. He cares. He could care less. So I found out. Or, for example, here's something that I found that was really remarkable. It is so well known to anybody who's living in New York that the churches that are now on Adam Clayton Powell Boulevard, that are on Malcolm X Boulevard, that these churches were once synagogues. You don't have to look too hard to find the Ten Commandments somewhere or Star of David or something like that. But then I came across a church on 131st Street and Madison Avenue that had 3 Stars of David, but that could never have been a synagogue. Never. Why? It was 10 stories tall. It had the spires of a church. It never had those pillars that a temple looked like. So when I inquired further, the man told me, well, I talked to a pastor. He said the story that was handed down was, yes, this was originally a church, but the man who sold the property was a man who was Jewish. And he was upset that he was selling it to a church, and so he made a deal with the church that they would have some reminder of his presence there, and they would have these Stars of David. And that's why they're there. But I learned you don't always take things at face value. You can't check everything out to the nth degree if you're doing a project of this scope. But some things, and this one aroused my curiosity, I wanted to check out. So I called, I think this is first, Dunlap, the person who writes about the churches for the New York Times, David Dunlap. And he told me, yes, it was designed by Renwick, who also designed St. Patrick's Cathedral, and was designed for the Irish community in 1893. So I went to the financial records down in the bottom of New York here, in the financial records office, and I looked up the property records to see if there were any Jewish-sounding names. And there were some that could have been Jewish. I never really got to the bottom of it. You have to accept you're not always going to get to the bottom of something, but the journey to get there is sometimes more interesting than what you find out at the end.
We're running a little short on time, unfortunately, but if any of you have some questions for her or Bill, we probably have time for a couple questions. Okay.
I have.
Pardon me?
Did you take pictures?
Yes, they're in the book.
Some of which are
here.
Anyone else? All the way in the back.
You mentioned that pretty much any neighborhood is safe now for walk during the day. Do you have any close calls? And do you think you could have done this 30 years ago?
Well, if I'd have done it 30 years ago, I'd have to have been even crazier than I am now. Because New York was 2,200 murders a year. But speaking about close calls, crime is a relative phenomenon still to this very day in New York. I talked to a woman in the Bronx, and I said, I was standing outside the Jackson houses, and I said to her, how's the neighborhood? Oh, it's bad. People getting killed here all the time. And I said, are you aware that the murder rate went from about 2,200 or something in 1992 to about 500 a year now? This was 3-4 years ago, before the 414 number came in a year ago. And she says, there's only 500 murders in New York? Well, let me tell you something, mister. If there's 500 murders a year, 400 of them is happening right outside my window. So much for the safe city. That would depend on where you are at any time of the day. And by the way, the neighborhoods that I still would consider somewhat dicey to venture in, even during the daytime, would be Brownsville, the Central Bronx, the West Bronx, South Jamaica, and parts of the West Bronx, those times, and East New York, which is probably the most dangerous. And, people don't understand these things. You find information all over the city. I walked into a bathroom in East New York, and it said, let it rain, let it flood, let a crip kill a blood. And I knew where I was. I was not on 78th Street and Park Avenue.
You also, if I might jump in, you approached your reporting and with in a particular style. I mean, you're very garrulous. You went into unfamiliar neighborhoods without fear, but most importantly, I think, by your description, you went in with great transparency, except not fully revealing that you were writing a book, but you went in showing your hands, as it were.
Yeah, I didn't like to tell people I was doing a book because I thought that they might be self-conscious. But sometimes I would say so. And I don't think it really ultimately mattered too much. For example, I'll tell you something that happened that's not in the book. When some journalists came over from Norway, and they said, let's go to a dangerous neighborhood. I said, you sure you want to do that? I said, yeah. They said, let's go to East New York. I said, okay. And I had a German photographer with me who was working with her, who lived in Park Slope for the last 20 years. And he was watching my modus operandi, which you so well described. And I walked out, I said, let's talk to that guy on the porch. He was sitting on a porch on Alabama Avenue, was behind bars. And he said, oh, I would be careful about that, sir. The photographer. I said, are you crazy? He says, what are you going to do? I said, you watch, come with me. I got out, and I yelled out to the guy. I said, hey, you want to be in a newspaper? These people came all the way from Norway to talk to you. Sure, he says, I want to be in there. And he came walking out. We did the whole interview. And she got bolder, and she said, I want to stand out here for a while. I said, I don't suggest that. I said, white women standing out here, that's not so good. And he said, but I want to stand here for a minute. I want to get the feel. So I said, okay, we'll stand in front of the laundromat. That lasted maybe 90 seconds. Because after 90 seconds, a man came by and said to somebody else, he said, and how are you going to like it when I stick a knife up your mother's butt? She says, I think we should go. I said, I agree with you. And by the way, to answer your question, did I have any close calls? Yes, I did. I had a couple of close calls. The closest call I had, and I consider myself very lucky to say that this was my closest call, was when I walked into a project, and I had my usual way of, how you doing, buddy? My way of dealing with people is to confront them openly, to walk up to somebody, look them in the eye, and say, how you doing?
It's disarming. And
it is very, and it's the unanticipated approach in an age of. Yeah, it is very, very disarming. My wife was worried I was going to get killed. She says, I'm worried about you. I said, you know what, we're going to Los Angeles to visit our son. We're going to walk through the bad neighborhoods there. And we're going to walk through, Crenshaw, we're going to walk Broadway, we're going to walk Inglewood. We're going to walk all these neighborhoods, Watts, Compton. And at the end of the day, we're going to walk about 10, 20 miles. Then we're either going to be dead or you're not going to be worried anymore. The result is clear. But the fact of the matter is, when I walked into this project, I did my usual song and dance. I said, hey, how's it going? This is a 16-year-old guy, and he had on these sunglasses. It was about 11 a.m., and he gave me like a sour look, and he had a yellow walkie-talkie. I remember it very, very clear. I'll never forget it. He looked into the walkie-talkie, and he said something in Spanish, and 7 heads popped up on the little grassy area on the other side of me, and they all stared at me. And I realized there's probably a drug deal going down here, and I got to get out of here. So I said, later, and I just walked out as quickly as I could without looking like I was walking quickly. So I want to tell you something. I do not want to mislead anybody and say that it's a cakewalk to walk this city. It has to do with how you walk, how you talk, how you look, how you dress. And you cannot plan. You can't train yourself for this because you have to respond spontaneously. They didn't train for you. They're not planning their responses to you. So if you can't get into the conversation, you got to get out of the kitchen.
Well, I think that's about all we've got time for tonight. But thank you so much to both of you guys for coming out, and thanks to all of you guys.
Thank you very much.